Chris Hani's killer, Janus Walus, has been released from prison on parole. The Department of Justice says he will remain under strict conditions for about 2 years. Walus was discharged from hospital today. He was receiving treatment for more than a week after he was stabbed by another inmate. Last month, the Constitutional Court ordered that Justice Minister Ronald Lamola release Walus on parole within 10 days. Those 10 days expired on Thursday. The stabbing incident delayed that process. Well, now joined in studio by Govan Whittles, who has been tracking this story. So, Govan, Minister given strict instruction to release Walus. He didn't have much choice, did he?
He didn't have much choice, and he seems to have responded directly to that Constitutional Court judgment. And interestingly, in the statement released by the Justice Ministry, it doesn't make any mention of a rescission application by the South African Communist Party. Let's begin with the Concourt judgment. It ordered Janus Walus's release on the basis that he couldn't do anything about the gravitas or the seriousness of the crime, which was the basis upon which his parole had earlier been denied by the Justice Ministry and then again by the High Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal. Eventually, the Constitutional Court making that order for him to be released. And interesting quotations from the statement from the Justice Ministry. I'll just take two of them. Ronald Lamola, the minister, noting here, in previously denying him parole, the decision was not in the spirit of avenging a stalwart of our liberation struggle, but it has always been within the context of giving effect to the interests of justice from the perspective of what the sentencing court sought to achieve. That's interesting because it speaks directly to that Constitutional Court order, which found he couldn't do anything about the seriousness of the offense. And then speaking about the parole system here, which is really the basis upon which he was released, of course, South Africa's parole system allowing for an offender to be released if he's a lifer after serving 25 years of his sentence. The Justice Minister, Ronald Lamola, saying our parole system is not a wanton license for unaccountability and impunity. Neither does it nullify the original verdict and sentence imposed by the courts. Parole is an acknowledged part of our correctional system. It has proved to be a vital part of reformative treatment for the paroled person who is treated by moral suasion. That, of course, so to echo the sentiments of the Constitutional Court in that order release. But no mention of that rescission application.
Well, we've just heard from Premier Panyaza Lesufi, who's spoken out against the release of Janus Walus, and obviously saying that he's not getting a hero's welcome. What about the alliance partners? What are their comments? How do they feel about this development?
It's clear that the South African Communist Party had anticipated his release on parole to be delayed by a rescission application. Interestingly, the march to the Jose Mampuru Correctional Center last week, where Walus was recovering in that Correctional Center hospital, was also, at that march, we also heard from the General Secretary of the Communist Party, which said that they would be continuing on rolling action. That's to make sure that Janus Walus, the killer of Chris Hani, doesn't get released. Today, the Communist Party in Limpopo, that's alongside the ANC and COSATU, are marching to the High Court, again calling for him not to be released. He's been released this morning, and that march, of course, now has to change its intention. Some of the Communist Party leaders attending there, but also happening at the same time is a Young Communist League conference in Ekurhuleni. That's the city where Chris Hani was gunned down, and that announcement being read out to the delegates of that conference, all communists, and had a heavy effect, shall we say. We'll bring you some information from that conference a little bit later, but it's clear that the SACP very unhappy. This is a surprise for them. They clearly believed that there was grounds for this to be delayed in the wake of the rescission application, and the Justice Ministry will have to answer on what they think of the rescission application and how they justify not taking that into account when the SACP believed there was grounds to do so.
Well, Govan, we don't expect him to return to his native Poland. Well, certainly not in the next 2 years, because for the next 2 years he's under strict conditions. Do we have any idea what those conditions are?
They haven't released the specific conditions which apply to Chris Hani's killer, Janus Walus, but we know some of the general conditions which always apply include daily check-ins with a parole official, also some form of continued consultation and reformative therapy, which the parolee needs to undergo. Remember, his sentence isn't over here. It's a life sentence, and serving on parole essentially means that you're serving the latter part of your sentence out in the public. What's different about Janus Walus is that his whereabouts in South Africa are a great point of interest. They were speculated on by the tripartite alliance as well. So the Department of Correctional Services has an additional responsibility to keep him safe and keep him in a place where he's able to serve his parole without any further threats coming on his life. We'll, of course, venture to give you more details on those conditions.
Well, you're absolutely right, certainly, to talk about his safety, because we do know that when it was announced that he would be released on parole, he was almost immediately stabbed in prison.
He was indeed. It's since emerged that the person who had stabbed him was someone that Janus Walus had a close relationship with for at least 2 years, that they'd been serving in the same housing unit. Walus having been kept in a single cell but interacting with other inmates at different points, like when he went to go get some dinner, and that's essentially when he was stabbed. While dishing up food, he was stabbed by someone who used to be in the South African Air Force, later described as a supporter of the Mkonto Wesizwe Liberation Army. That's the army for which Chris Hani was the chief of staff. Chris Hani, of course, having been the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, and at the time of his death, described as the second most popular leader in South Africa after Nelson Mandela. Clive Derby-Lewis, the former Krugersdorp mayor, member of the Conservative Party that provided the gun which was used to kill Chris Hani, saying that they had done so because they believed that the ANC couldn't control Chris Hani, and that he was so popular in the party. So Janus Walus still having a lot to answer for, according to the SACP, and definitely Chris Hani's widow, Dimpo Hani, who has said even more recently that she refuses to forgive him because they maintain that he hasn't told the entire story of why he killed Chris Hani.
Not that he's remorseful either. I'm sorry, just to bring that in. I mean, certainly some of the video that we've watched in the past has shown that he lacks any form of remorse.
We've seen that Janus Walus and Clive Derby-Lewis indicating that they were performing a task which was in turn in line with the objectives they sought to achieve at the time in 1993. They described it as having killed a communist and someone who was on the opposing side of their ideology. This is an interesting area of debate, because essentially in 1993 there was a peace treaty between Mkonto Wesizwe and the apartheid regime, and that peace treaty was violated with the killing of Chris Hani, which was seen as a crime by both sides against the peace treaty. And at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this was debated at length, but eventually the bishops in charge of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission decided not to grant amnesty to Janus Walus, even though he said that he had done this as a political act, because they believed that he hadn't shown sufficient remorse, but also that he hadn't elaborated on the true extent of what was behind this. They've maintained their story, Janus Walus and Clive Derby-Lewis, throughout. They haven't elaborated any further. And this comes as the SACP and the ANC call for an inquest into Chris Hani's assassination. That inquest would mean witnesses being called. Of course, Janus Walus would certainly be one of the people that they would hope to speak to get him under oath, testifying about who he spoke to and what his real intentions were, if they were beyond what he said to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Govan, Whittles, appreciate your time. Govan was unpacking the release of Janus Walus.